past year, since March 2020, the current COVID pandemic has forced us to close along with all the other institutions. But we believe that our mission, our work have taken on even a greater urgency. So, and then nationally generated, you've got the broadly circulated anti-Chinese rhetoric and anti-Chinese, anti-Asian hate. It's all contributing to a lot of suspicion, racism, and violence against Americans of Asian descent, and to fear among those that are targeted. So what we're hoping with our work is that we can tell powerful stories of the Chinese immigrant experience, of discrimination, exclusion that has been shown through the decades, and also of resilience and success. So we feel that our work is even more important than ever in order to expand on these themes. And so I welcome the Vanport Mosaic. I welcome the opportunity that there is a platform that we can try to reclaim all the stories that there are of old Chinatown. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much.
And by the way, we hope to be reopening, a soft reopening the weekend of July 2nd and 3rd by appointment only. And our website is www.portlandchinatown.org. We'll have more information about that.
Thank you so much. Oops, I don't know what's wrong with the sound, but thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And thank you for taking your time. So again, I want to just welcome everybody for joining us tonight. We are coming out of this incredible, hopefully, year of COVID and social justice work. Our awareness and our actions have been changing over this year, and really coming to a reckoning of what Sarah was talking about, of the historic racism within our country. And the title of the Vanport Mosaic Festival is called We the People. So I want to raise that up during this conversation as well. So we've had many conversations. This is part of our Reclaiming Old Town project that's part of Stories and Movement, our last year with the Community Life program. And I want to just say that what we're going to talk about tonight is a combination of questionnaire answers that we sent out, and I'll share some of those with you. Some people who we've asked to join us to talk about Old Town, the history, and also to talk about where we are now. So the questions that I raised tonight are the questions that I'm asking all of you to think about as we go along through this conversation tonight. I just wanted to say that I want you to listen to these questions, everybody that's here. They seem very simple, but we got a lot of responses. And so I'm going to share with you kind of a little collection of those responses to some of the questions. So what is your relationship to Old Town? And what do you love about Old Town? And so this is just a short little thing about it. And then I'm going to invite Vicky Nakashima, Alan Lazo, and Roberta Wong. I don't believe Kimberly Moreland is in, but if she is, she'll join us too. So what is your relationship to Old Town? And what do you love about Old Town? So my relationship with this place is where I work, live, and volunteer. It's where I have become a big fan and studied. It's my grandparents' history, and it's almost forgotten. It's been important to my life, my education, and my spiritual growth. It's where I learned to organize and work with community and watch performances and speak my language. It has fed, housed, taught, and embraced me. I love this place with history, culture, the diversity of people and unique architecture, historical landmarks, and water and trees. It is accessible with community and memories. It has true character and a light rail to take you there. So that's a synopsis of some of the answers to those questions in our ask. And so I just like to invite Vicki and Alan and Roberta to share a little bit about their personal history and connection to Old Town as we remember and as we reclaim Old Town today.
Well, thank you. Alan, where are you? There's Alan. Hi, Alan.
Hi, Vicki, how are you?
Let me share, I'm just a little bit of background. I moved here in 1967 from Seattle, and I immediately felt like I had a connection to Old Town, Chinatown. It took me a while to realize the significance of Old Town, Chinatown to the Japanese American community. I served on the board of Marylhurst University, and one day one of the sisters pulled me aside and said, "Do you know about St. Paul Mickey School?" And I said, "You know, I have to say I don't know about that school." She said, "Well, during I believe it would have been the 1920s or 30s, when so many of the Japanese lived in Old Town, the sisters realized they faced such discrimination that there was only one school that they could go to, and sometimes that wasn't really accessible. So they created a school in a church here, and the sisters taught the children. George Nakata, who passed away recently, like in the last couple weeks, he told me when I asked him about it within the last year during the pandemic, he said, "I'm the last living Japanese American who went to that school, and all of the sisters who taught there are now gone, but they would host a get together for all the students who went to St. Paul Mickey School." He shared a story in a Street Roots article that I just cherish about, I believe it was George that was given a racist comment about, "Why don't you go back where you came from?" And he said he just came out with, "I belong here. I'm American. I belong here." And he said it was natural for him to say, "I belong here," against somebody who was white and much larger and very, very much older. But he said, "Those nuns told me to say that. I just know it." So my love of this Old Town started way back, and I remember that my grandfather was a friend of the Nato grandpa, and so we got to come and go to the store and go upstairs and visit when I was young. And I remember Kita Company. I wouldn't have had any appliances or kitchen supplies if it wasn't for Kita Company, and so many other locations. So that's my memory.
Thank you so much, Vicki. I'm Alan. If you don't mind, I'm going to go to Roberta, because Roberta has been in some of our smaller discussions and shared her rich connections. So Roberta Wong.
Hi, I'm part of a 3-generation family business that began in 1930 with my grandfather, Sun Yuk Wong, and he came over with his 2 older sons, and they started Tucklon Company located on 4th and Everett at that time. And my earliest memories was attending the Chinese Presbyterian Church, which was located between 3rd and 4th in the parking lot where the barrel is, and the next to Hung Far Low building, there was a sunken garden, and that's what I remember playing there in those early days. And Mrs. Setzel was the teacher there at the time. The Reverend Lee was the pastor, and unfortunately that, well, I don't know if it's unfortunate, it's progress. That church eventually moved over to the southeast side. And again, that area became vacant and parking lots became replaced a lot of the buildings that were demolished during those times in the 60s. Also in the 60s, I remember going to Chinese school every Saturday, and that was a place of socialization for us as kids. That's where our parents sent us so that we would hopefully grasp the language and maybe meet potential mates perhaps in the future. But I started coming down on a daily basis in 62 when our family business migrated up a block. At that time, my grandmother had already passed away, and it was the business managed by my father and my brother. And they, at that point, started the concept of the grocery store with the cafe, because at that point, my father had back injuries from the heavy lifting. And my brother, who was in college at that time, he had to quit to manage the business. And he opened the coffee shop as an option for my dad to continue working, but not involved in the heavy labor that grocery business involves. And so that began in 62, and it went on for about 10, 15 years before my brother's vision to build a new building and have a more modern structure, which was the current Tuckline building on 4th and Davis with the 2-story building. So he had the grocery store on the main level, and upstairs a full-fledged restaurant with a lounge and banquet rooms and all that. So he fulfilled his dream, and he was part of the renaissance of Chinatown in the 80s when they built the new Chinatown gate. And as a child, I remember taking the bus down to go to work after school every day, you know, and I started age 9, taking the Rose City bus back through downtown Portland and go past all the old theaters and on 4th Avenue. And in my PSU days, I would walk daily from PSU down to Old Town. And again, that was a cultural experience in itself. So again, I went to Chinese school. I didn't retain a lot, but I did appreciate that experience and the few friends that I still retain today. And I think I was there until 85 when I went on my own path. But I recently got involved with the Portland Chinatown Museum as a volunteer. So that's brought me back down to the area and again, initiated my letters to the mayor about our homeless issues and dealing with the Landmarks Commission in terms of them ignoring the historic goals of building heights and things like that they've established. And my concern again for the future is to let them know that we're still here, we're still involved, we have not abandoned our history or our place. It's just a question of, you know, younger generations coming back to reclaim, as Chisao has framed, our past and our future, because what's lacking today, I think, is the vision that the city has the opportunity to repurchase vacant lots and to prioritize their use. I can see a marketplace in the old parking lots that will help support, vendors, food vendors. But again, that's another topic. I'll let you continue on with Alan.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Roberta. There's such a rich history that we don't want to forget. So thank you so much for sharing that. Alan, you have a little bit different relationship with Old Town, maybe a little newer one.
I do, and I really appreciate that framing from all of this. I really do feel like this outsider, and that I don't have a place in Old Town, but that's really the point for me as I've come to learn about the stories in Old Town and its history, frankly, right? I'm a second generation Filipino American. My parents are immigrants here from the Philippines, but I've been in Portland for more than 50 years. And it wasn't until I started to do the work I do now, about 10 or 15 years ago, that I really started to understand some of the stories around us, and some of them that are really related to place. And I think it was a really difficult reckoning for me, frankly, that really brought me into the work I'm doing. And one of those places I think is really related to Old Town. The work we do at the Fair Housing Council of Oregon, we have that bus tour that we do of historical housing discrimination, segregation, and displacement. And the first time I went on that, about 12 years ago, I heard Valerie Otani speak, who's also passed away. And I was so moved by that history, and in part because I didn't know so much of the history. And I realized, just as we talk about on our bus tour, that part of it is because so much of that history around us has been erased or displaced. And when I think about the relationship to Old Town, I think about those communities that over time sought a place there for so many different reasons, whether it was community or safety or economics or whatever it was, yet the community around it couldn't find a way to preserve that, right? That the only thing that happened was this sense that folks have been displaced. And that's the concern that we share in our organization about place and who gets to be in places. When we talk about we the people, I think it's a real question about what that means. It's a phrase that certainly is held in high regard in this country, but I don't think we very often think about what that means in the world around us. And I think that for many of us, we definitely don't feel like we have been included in that phrase. And I think that tends to extend physically into the places that we are allowed to hold, frankly.
It's a rather interesting dilemma, because the answers in a lot of the answers to our questionnaire about what do you love about Old Town is about the culture and the diversity and the rich history and the stories. And so thank you, Vicki and Roberta and Alan, for sharing a little bit. I want to really uplift some of what Sarah started out with, because this section of our conversation is going to involve the heart of what's happening in Old Town, which preserves a lot of this history, which is our cultural organizations, our cultural institutions. And there's been an investment there to maintain our presence there with the Chinatown Museum. And also Elizabeth Nye now is going to join us, and Eliza Kenzie Jones and Judy Margulis. And they are in charge of, or overseeing and involved of, our cultural institutions in Old Town. I am going to speak on on behalf of the Japanese American Museum of Oregon. And Judy, is Judy there? Andrew, Judy Margulis, I think I saw her.
I'm here.
Okay, so Andrew just needs to put you there because I don't see you. I'm going to start because the Japanese American Museum of Oregon was redesigned and built during this past year of COVID. We're in a new location on 4th and Flanders, and we're currently having time visit, but because of our history, because of the Mickey School, because of George Nakata, because of so many people that came before us in our community, we have really wanted to stay and invest in what was Nihonmachi, or Japantown. And so this weekend, I think we're going to open even more. I invite everybody to come down to see this new space. We used to be called the Oregon Nikkei Legacy Center, but now we are officially the Japanese American Museum of Oregon at Nato Center. So I just want to uplift that history that we bring. And if you want to see, we had a virtual grand opening and it's still available for people to see. If you go on grandopening.jamo.org, you can see our hour-long show. So let me welcome Elizabeth and Judy and Eliza with the Oregon Historical Society, and invite you to share with us a little bit about the significance of your organizations being in historic Old Town. Who would like to start? Judy? Are you on mute? Are you ready and live? There you go.
You would think after all this time one would understand technology, but to this day I don't. Thank you, really. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Chisao, for organizing this. I didn't really prepare anything, so I'll just talk very briefly about what our institution is doing, and perhaps just by way of introduction, what I'll say about the museum. I'm just going to read you our mission statement and our value statement, and then I'll say a few other things. The Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education explores the legacy of the Jewish experience in Oregon, teaches the universal lessons of the Holocaust, and provides opportunities for intercultural conversation. We challenge our visitors to resist indifference and discrimination and to envision a just and inclusive world. So actually we've been in Old Town since June of 2017, so it's been 4 years. We actually started in Old Town, so we were at 3rd and Davis, right where the Chinatown Museum is. So it's so wonderful to see that space now occupied by a museum. That was actually our first real physical space. Then we took a little sojourn up to Kearney and 19th, and now we're back in Old Town, and we're so glad to be there. But of course, the neighborhood has undergone such extreme devastation in the last 4 years, and then especially since the pandemic. So I think we just have to be mindful that we're facing 3 pandemics. We're facing COVID, we're facing racial violence, we're facing houselessness. And I think Old Town has been battered by these 3 pandemics. And I'll just say as well, knowing that I'm with my Japanese American friends and my Chinese American friends, that our 3 cultures, I'm not positive of the statistic, but I imagine between the 3 cultures, we are accounting for 60 to 65% of all hate crime incidents reported in this country right now. In May alone, there was a 115% increase in anti-Semitic attacks. So we're at war. I mean, there is really a lot of discrimination happening today, and it's very sobering to realize that. So how does my institution deal with this? Well, perhaps as Laura and Chisao said, you're calling this event We the People. which is so beautiful. There's so many things to think about it. But one of the things I'd like to say about We the People, which is very germane to an exhibition that we have, one of our core exhibitions at the museum is called Discrimination and Resistance, an Oregon Primer. And we're really trying to teach people that there are tools that are used to discriminate against others, right? And one of the tools I want to suggest to us tonight is the tool of dehumanization. And I think one of the things I, as a white woman working in a Jewish institution, have to reconcile is my own privilege. And I have to, and I want my community, I want the work we do at the museum, help people who are participating in our programs, whatever. We all need to recognize that there are people in this neighborhood who are suffering. You know, we're all confronted with the tents, with the houselessness, with people doing extreme things right outside our windows, yet they are human beings and they are suffering. So I think the question that we wrestle with most in my institution is, what is our responsibility? I always say that one of the things, you know, as museum workers, we are not able to go in, you know, we don't regularly go into the North Park blocks and feed people. We aren't allowed to let the houseless population use our washrooms or our electric plugs to charge their phones. We just, for security reasons, we can't do that. So where do we center our activism? We center it through education, right? It is the one tool we have to teach the community that we the people, right? We're all in this together. It is, I think, our biggest challenge right now is to make sure we all understand the insidious forms of discrimination and what we're all facing. So we do that within the walls of my institution by educating, as I said, about discrimination in Oregon. We do teach about the Holocaust and other genocides. We do teach about the Oregon Jewish experience. And some of the projects that we've been working on to help expand our purview, and they might not sort of fit the conversation exactly, but I think they're important. We've really launched a project trying to bring digital equity to the work we're doing. So we are in the process of working on our website, expanding the tools on our website to make sure that more of what we do within the walls of the museum are available for people who are coming to our website. For example, trying to put our collections online. We have we actually were very fortunate to get a grant, and we are in the process of publishing our collections. In our collections, for example, we have an archive of an Oregon Jew who was very involved in the skinhead movement in the 1990s. So there's a lot of things we can learn there. We have a knife and a fork of a prisoner who was incarcerated at Auschwitz when he was, between the ages of 13 and 16 years old, etc. And the other thing we're doing is we're really gathering the stories. We have what we call I think it's called Dwelling in the Time of Plagues, but it is a massive oral history project that we've been working on since last August. We have actually, as part of this project, we have 275 interviews to date, really talking to people about racial equity, about the pandemic, about what they've been going through. So we are trying to capture stories. I'll leave it there, but happy to take questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Judy. So Elizabeth is the executive director of Lonsu Chinese Garden. And can you share with us, Elizabeth, a little bit about what you've been doing and what's at the heart of your mission?
Thank you so much, Chisao, and thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit about the organization and what we're doing. Let me just start off by providing a little bit of context. Similar to Judy, I will share the mission of Lonsu, specifically is to cultivate an oasis of tranquil beauty and harmony, and to inspire, engage, and educate a global community in an authentic, richly authentic Chinese culture. By way of background, Lonsu was officially opened September 14th, 2000. So we are right now celebrating we're in the midst of our 20th anniversary year. The pandemic did dramatically disrupt what we had envisioned for this 20th anniversary year. I joined the organization in October, and in the course of getting to know Lonsu, I actually have been doing a deep dive on our history. And I thought that for tonight, I would share some of the things that I have found in doing that deep dive about our history and the role that Lonsu originally was in, the role that the founders of Lonsu envisioned for Chinatown. So in particular, when thinking about bringing this Chinese garden to Chinatown, there was a very committed group of leaders and volunteers and city officials, and they got together and put together a list of what the objectives for Lonsu were, and some of these objectives, including expressing the values and traditions of ancient China. They also were looking at creating an atmosphere for meditation, contemplation, leisure, and artistic enjoyment. It was also important to this group that this Chinese garden fosters a cultural exchange in the process of creating and maintaining this garden. So they saw the garden as this vehicle for cultural exchange, all along a path towards, in their minds, promoting world understanding, peace, and racial harmony. There also was, and I do want to point this out, an objective around Lonsu being a catalyst for the neighborhood, and not just the neighborhood of Old Town Chinatown, but also Portland, vis-a-vis creating stronger ties with the Chinese sister cities, and really establishing in their minds Portland's Trans-Pacific leadership. I think that in thinking about the where Lonsu is today, and where in my journey through our history and into our present, one thing that I will say in terms of our role recently, vis-a-vis everything that's been happening in the world and in our city and in our community with Asian hate crimes, it's been, I think, a journey for us, because I think the organization viewed itself as always believing that the power of the garden to promote cultural understanding is important, very important to our identity. And we view ourselves as, had viewed ourselves as an inherently non-political space. And that our role really is being able to provide a place for people to find refuge, find solace, tranquility, and peace. And that's our greatest asset in promoting peace, is that it's a place where deep learning, listening, contemplation can happen away from, and giving people that space. I think the thing that I've come to appreciate about the Chinese garden that makes us unique from other gardens on some level, there is an element of a Chinese garden that is specifically designed to challenge people. It's not enough to come into our space and just find it to be a peaceful place, but in the whole nature of a Chinese garden, there's some element of chaos, there's some element of challenge, and asking you to dig deeper into yourself and find new connections that you might not have seen before. That's really, I would say, where the garden, is just beginning to really build its voice and identity in providing not just a peaceful place, but also a place that asks people to challenge themselves, learn, contemplate, listen, and change.
And that's what we're doing tonight, hopefully, all those things. I wanted to, before I get to you, Eliza, because I wasn't planning on representing the Japanese American Museum of Oregon tonight. Lynn Fujigami with Parks was going to be here, but unfortunately she couldn't join us. So I just want to say that the Japanese American Museum has transited over about a 32-year period from people seeing and having the vision for a museum, but it really all started with the redress movement, which was in the mid-70s. And then when people became more activated and shared a story and a history that they had not talked about. The second and first generation had not talked about their experience of being sent to American concentration camps and being erased from the community that they had built, which is the history of historic Old Town and Japantown and Nihonmachi. And really being torn away from what they had invested and built over a long period of time, their homes, grocery stores, businesses, dentists, doctors, churches, schools, were all in this area that we now call historic Old Town. And this is why it was so important for the Japanese American Museum of Oregon to maintain its presence in this area. But it first started with the Japanese American Historical Plaza, which was built in the late 1980s and dedicated. And because of that vision, putting our presence in stone and in poetry is a pretty powerful way to do this. And that plaza reflects the history of Japanese Americans throughout early immigration to America, the break in our history in the wall, continuing on to the passage of the Reparations Act. And so with that plaza was the first beginning of the inspiration for a museum. And we're just so fortunate that the Nato family was there then and helped us in the beginning, and is another reason why we are the Japanese American Museum of Oregon at Nato Center. We also uplift the stories, oral history stories, and the stories of civil rights heroes, which everyone should know that there's a Minyasui Day in Oregon because Minyasui is all of our heroes, because he stood up during a time when individuals were not standing up. And so in kind of making sure that we are not erased and fighting against that, we are telling those stories. But the part of it that we're excited to open this new museum, but we're also challenged because we've had our mural windows vandalized. Today or yesterday, we had Black Lives Don't Matter written on the steps of our former space it's called the Japanese American Museum of Oregon Annex, where we hope to hold a lot of community gatherings and performances and really uplifting stories in a live way. So Eliza, you are with the Oregon Historical Society, so you kind of transit many of our stories. And so from your perspective of seeing all these stories and being involved and engaged through the Oregon Historical Society, which is not in Old Town, but you've definitely invested here. What do you have to say about this place?
Thanks, Chisao. Yeah, with the Oregon Historical Society, our building is a few blocks south in what's called the Cultural District, so near the Portland Art Museum, and it's between Old Town and Portland State University, basically. And I'll share our mission also, which is to preserve our state's history and make it accessible to everyone in ways that advance knowledge and inspire curiosity about all the peoples, places, and events that have shaped Oregon. And that's a mission that we revised and created 5-7 years ago. I'm not quite sure. within the past 10 years. And it's really, we have a vision statement that goes with it that we believe we foster a better tomorrow when we have an Oregon story that's meaningful to all Oregonians. And that's really a pretty, for those who are familiar with the idea of the Oregon story, that's a pretty explicit way of pushing back against the idea that there's a narrow Oregon story that begins with Lewis and Clark and culminates with the Oregon Trail. You know, some other folks would include an Oregon story that is the sort of Tom McCall and Mark Hatfield era as well. And I think those stories are meaningful and important and powerful, but they are not necessarily meaningful to all Oregonians. And so as an organization that is supposed to be serving the entire state and serving that state through a wide variety of different tools and resources and activities, from museum exhibits to educational resources to archives to scholarly publications. What does it mean then to change the Oregon story so that it's meaningful to all Oregonians? We really, for us, our connection with Old Town really is with the community partnerships that we have with, you know, the organizations like those represented on this screen, also with the Portland Chinatown Museum and with other organizations wherever possible in Old Town. And we work with Jennifer Fang, who's also at the Japanese American Museum of Oregon, and she's talked often about how to center Chinese history in Oregon history so that it's not an extra story that's told, but one that is at the very center of how we think about the history of Oregon. So, you know, our work has to do with helping to make that happen, right? Helping to make it happen so that at the center of what Oregonians think of as their history is a much broader and richer set of stories. And I think for us, again, as I said, working with Old Town, that really has to do with working with partners. Chisao, you're using this wonderful word this evening of uplifting these voices and uplifting these stories. And so, you know, OHS has a platform that we like to use to share out the stories and work that other folks are doing, and maybe that we're doing as well to try and change this narrative. And I think I was listening to what Elizabeth was saying about the garden being a place where you are challenged and the value in being challenged, and the ways that sort of refuge and challenge can sit next to each other. And I think that good public history can do the same thing. We have spent a lot of the past year talking in invited talks about racism in Oregon history. And our executive director and I give a 1-hour talk about racism in Oregon history, a brief overview. And we talk about Menyasui and talk about, you know, some of these other histories that are necessary for folks to know. So I think that, and we find sometimes that folks are challenged by that and don't know how to respond to it. So our work is then in helping folks figure out that response. And so I'll just quote one of Oregon's most wonderful historians, Dr. Daryl Milner, who has taught so many of us so much about Black history in Oregon and the ways that that is at the center of Oregon history. And he always says that we are not responsible for the past, but we are responsible for our relationship with the past. And I think that's a really good mantra for a lot of the work that we try to do at the Oregon Historical Society, is try to have a responsible relationship with the past. And that requires really that truth telling. And for us, oftentimes, you know, also that listening. I think right now, a lot of that work, as we've seen, is really under attack. You know, this idea that you would be explicit about history of the United States. There are some people who are very uncomfortable with that and very resistant to that. And so really being direct about the ways in which the privileges of whiteness are inscribed in our public policies is something that I think is important to us right now. And then just to reflect a little bit on, you know, Judy talking about just the wonderful exhibit on the tools of discrimination and tools of resistance that's at OJMCHE, and that, you know, we should all visit frequently to think about those tools. But really that tool of discrimination, of dehumanization, and this idea that some people are more worthy than others. That tool is, I think, insidious, and we can sometimes see that kind of idea in the past in ways that are more difficult for us to see in the present. But once we see those patterns in the past, we can then recognize them in the present. And so I think that people look to the Oregon Historical Society, as they do many other history organizations, often to try and make sense of the present through a better understanding of the past. And I think, when I think of Old Town, when I think of my neighborhood, when I think of the city right now, and I think of the whole state, as some of the incredible work that Street Roots reporters have done to show us that there is a humanitarian crisis of poverty and houselessness. That raises the question for us at the Historical Society of what kinds of stories and explorations of the past can we bring to people to help them understand how this has come to be and what solutions are available. I mean, the solutions, the people in those communities know what the solutions are. But how to make change happen, we can look to the past, I think, to help us understand that. So those, I'm not sure if I answered your question. She's how I sort of just.
Great, thank you.
Okay, yeah.
I think the important thing that I want to lift up is that all of these histories are all of our history.
Exactly.
The Japanese American history is not just my history, it's an American history, as is the Chinese history. And I also, since Sarah was on earlier talking about the Chinatown Museum, I just want to bring forward that, they've been making murals down there. They've been engaging young people and artists to beautify some of the area around their museum. They've been holding markets down there, and a lot of youth are beginning to come. So I think there's some really positive actions that are happening. I just wanted to go back and regroup. So thank you, Elizabeth, Judy, and Eliza, for taking your time tonight. Because this conversation tonight is a call to activate our collective imagination and our creative expression. And we want to engage in a civic dialogue across differences, and we want to build relationships, because together we can envision what we must do to reclaim Old Town. So I'm going to refer back to the questionnaire and the questions that we asked people, and some of those responses that I collected and will present to you. So, and then we'll hear from another group of people, but all of these are now we're looking at what are the challenges that we're facing? What are, what have you done? What has your organization done to meet some of these challenges as we reclaim Old Town? And so this is what some of the responses I want to share with you said. Our Old Town is out of balance. We are all traumatized and without a plan, a lack of vision, and true leadership. It is a humanitarian crisis. Can we create affordability, get clean, and stop outside developers? Are we enabling, gentrifying, and creating non-lasting impacts? There's too much fighting. Businesses are leaving, and there's no plan. There is an inability to solve problems and claim the area. Do not abandon, demolish, or destroy. But we have worked together. We have worked to build relationships and raise awareness. We have paid for security. We've written letters, attended hearings, shopped and donated services, and we have been fierce advocates. We are the true historic district of Portland and for Portland. We are on constant watchfulness. In our second circle, I would like to invite Kaya Sand, who's the executive director of Street Roots. Is Jane Gordon here, who's with the University of Oregon? Laquita Lanford, who has a long history of living and being an activist in Old Town. And I'm not sure if Jesse Burke is here, but I would like to welcome these people to really talk about, from your perspective, what do you see right now through COVID as we're moving forward and as we look toward reclaiming Old Town? How about Kaya with Street Roots and all the wonderful work you've been doing?
Thank you, Giselle, and thank you, Lara and Andrew, for making all this beautiful conversation happen. You know, I'm going to root this in my love of Old Town and just a little bit of my personal connection, because it does connect to how I see it. So my grandmother was homeless and housing insecure up and down the West Coast. But by the time she was 17, she would always tell me about being homeless and then in a motel in Portland, Skid Row is how she would describe it. And the bed bugs in the motel, and then her little brother was on the street. So she finally scooped him up. She had dropped out of high school at what's now Lincoln High School. And then they got on a Greyhound, started over again. So it was always this story that, you know, really connected to a lot of her resilience. And I was extremely close to her all of my life. I found that motel, and it actually is the Porter Motel. So it's just south of Burnside on 3rd and Pine. And you can actually look in a window and find the old sign there. So for me, Old Town has always been that place of displacement and homelessness. And then as an artist, I came in and worked with the Japanese American Museum of Oregon, what was Oregon Nikkei Legacy Center, on a project actually connecting homelessness to displacement, and of Nihon Machi. And I got to talk to a lot of elders, and it was a real privilege. And again, heard those stories of loss, of eviction, of, you know, May 6th, 1942, when everyone was evicted from their homes, many of them motels. And elders would tell me stories of, you know, losing things, right? Losing the dollhouse of the Japanese dolls that the father had to throw down the furnace so that it wasn't discovered. Or Ocean Nipu Times, the newspaper that's actually across the street from Street Roots, this connection of newspaper to newspaper. And the US Navy came in and seized the Japanese type. So now working there among unhoused people, the seizure of property, the forced eviction, it just feels like it's this continuous thread of Old Town. It is the river beneath our feet. And so I always try to think about Nihon Machi as much as I can wherever I am, and connecting it up to this kind of eviction that's always happening. During the pandemic, one thing that became really interesting for a lot of people in their tents is because of the CDC recommendation, they weren't getting swept. And it was almost like an ocean wave receded, and they were just left on the beach, and everyone else was kind of gone. And people started organizing, you know, on that would be second. There were people that the unhoused people along there started doing barbecues with hamburgers at night, and sometimes people would pull up with a truck and do concerts. So it was really interesting because there was a way in which people could form longer lasting community. And one thing that's so important, I think, and probably a lot of people on this call, you know, is when you get to know people in the tents, you know their name, they're your neighbors. But of course, because people are moved constantly, that's so much more difficult. But there's certain people, there's a man that's lived on a stoop on Davis, you know, for 10 years, right? And it's a relationship with the shop. But I can stop there and say his name every single night. And, you know, I think about, so now, of course, things are much more like a roiling sea for people again. But I associate this one moment during the pandemic when there's a stretch of tents and there's this green tent, the guy goes by the name Wookie, and then the woman named Veronica, who's like this Shakespearean actress, in the tent next door. And I just was going home, gonna catch my bus. I said, "Good night, Wookie." And he said, "Do you know what Ring Around the Rosie refers to?" And I said, "I don't." And then Veronica in the next tent in her like growly voice was like, "The bubonic plague." and it was just this kind of incredible like conversation that was rooted in the pandemic. So I guess, when I think about Old Town, I'm just kind of going through all those layers because to me, they're all so interconnected. And that, what we at Street Roots really were able to seize upon during the pandemic is the leadership of people on the streets. And Chisao, you know this well, working so closely with some of our Street Roots vendors on their storytelling. And, we were able to lift up the fact that they're always doing public health work. They're always taking care of each other's wounds, that the leadership of people, the creativity, the resourcefulness of people that Laquita knows well, is something that we shouldn't push aside, right? When we think about reclaiming Old Town, the people who are unhoused in its streets possess some of that leadership and that ability for us to really imagine what the future looks like.
Thank you. I just want to make a note here. We were doing really good and now we're at 7-Eleven. No, that's not the store, but the time. Because there's not a 7-Eleven in Old Town, is there? I don't think so. No. And I would still like to get into kind of the envisioning part of this, but I want to go on and I want to repeat that part where we are all traumatized in this situation. And so Laquita Lanford, welcome to our journey.
Yes, thank you all this evening. I'm just really blown away, and I'm really grateful to, be a part of this conversation, as I have had a connection with Old Town for about 20 years. My second apartment that I moved into here in Portland was on 5th and Davis. And I found that apartment on my way to work because at the time I worked for a Portland Health Alternative Health Clinic was PAC. David Eisen was the director, and Sheila, can't remember Miss Sheila's name, but they pretty much hired me as a 23-year-old young Black woman trying to find my, not find myself, but in that journey of discovering myself. I'm not a Black Portland nativer, but I moved here in 1995. I am the daughter of an immigrant from Central America. I am the granddaughter of an immigrant from Central America. We are from the Garinagu tribe, the Garifuna people, and we reside throughout Central America, also Los Angeles, Chicago, New York. All of my people came on my father's side and my mother's side, came to America as Black slaves or to help build America. So I'm an American. I was born in America. And my relationship, I just want to some of the places up to me in Portland, even during that time, was the Red Lion Bakery. Space Bar was a place, but before Space Bar, it was a day labor place. There was a plasma, a space on, what's that street right there? But just like right where the MAX train passes through that area. But when I found that apartment, I really felt connected to the downtown. Always had a connection and love. Like, I feel like Portland's downtown is not like any city and state. Although I'm from Los Angeles, I was born in LA. And Kaya, you mentioned Skid Row. As a kid, we lived not too far from Skid Row. And so when I heard about, well, what the phrase would come up, the hood or the ghettos of Portland, I was like, you haven't been to Los Angeles, California. You haven't been to Chicago. You haven't been to the projects, because the projects here look a lot different than the projects in other urban cities. And during this pandemic, there's so much I want to say. I wrote down a lot of notes, but I lived in Old Town from 2000 to 2004, and I moved away and I moved somewhere, another part of the city. But the connection with the African American community that's where I saw the majority of Black people on a daily basis, passing through my neighborhood because of what they was considered drugs, or but the connection before that lies back from the 1900s on Davis and Flanders and Alder, like all those places that I didn't know until this most recent history, and being in this cultural space downtown, which that's why I rediscovered and fell in love with Old Town in 2014 when I moved back to Portland. Took me 6 months to find a place, and I got housing myself through Transitional Project, and I'm still currently in my smallest studio apartment since 2014 up until this day. And through my journey, in 2014, the end of 2014, Mike Brown was murdered in the streets and laid down in the streets for 4 hours. And something that just like resurfaced and traumatized me of being harassed in downtown Portland as a Black person, just walking to from Fred Meyer's down Burnside and harassed by police. And I didn't know why I was being harassed. So I have a lot of relationship with connections in Old Town. Floyd's Coffee Shop back in the day used to be a nightclub, and I hosted an event there. So I have a lot of love for Floyd's Coffee Shop, is where during the pandemic, I was able to activate the space, bring a museum or an exhibit of the work that I had seen over a period of years from working as a housing caseworker with Urban League of Portland, not really doing my own thing, but yes, seeing the gaps in the system and things in my neighborhood and what I wanted to be. Ms. Judy mentioned something about responsibility. So I took it as my responsibility as a resident of Old Town, but also as someone that is a human and see another human being suffering. And during the pandemic, it was just, like Kaya said, stay at home from the governor, stay safe. But I felt like, how can I stay at home and stay safe when my neighbors are out on the streets of downtown? And there were more people that had came into the neighborhood because what I gathered, months later, is that the services and people was not being swept. So I took that as an opportunity as there were conversations happening in the work that I started working to build out a cultural village, which I refer to as Afro Village. But at the time, it was just my thought, and what it could be. And I wasn't ready to provide that complete space. But what I thought that I could do was activate parts of my vision, which was a hygiene station, and having a safe bathroom and a place for women and our folks in our community to go. So it took me about 3 weeks to find a porta potty company to bring a porta potty to Old Town. And I asked the owner of Floyd's Coffee Shop, Nicole. She actually called me and she said, Q, I know you're working on stuff. There's people down in Old Town. You got any resources? So I didn't know I was going to get the stimulus check because I've been an independent bum contractor and activist for 3 years. And I got my stimulus check and I took that half of that and I got supplies for people, and I got emergency preparedness things and tents, because at the time the county and the city did not have PPE for people. There was really, like we said, the plan. There was no plan. So I just jumped in and took action, set up shop after the exhibit, which would have been a year to Juneteenth this weekend. Is when I set the exhibit. And after the exhibit, we started to do pop-up showers, and I connected with all the people in my community, or in the grassroots organization that could bring hot cultural meals, because what I recognized immediately, there was more Black people on the streets that I had not seen. And there was a lot of Black men. And it just like really, like, I was like, this is my community. Like I had been wanting to, as far as the true ethnics of the Afro village is that connection on a cultural level. Because all I've heard in the last few years that I've hosted a bike ride and learned about Vanport is that the Black people of Portland don't have a place. And so someone also mentioned about the young people reclaiming, like to see young Black professionals and young Black folks of their families not being able to have and redlining and things, but for them to come back and be a part of this richness and this vision. That's the work that I, have been partnering up with people. So there was just a lot of things. I mean, one of the, across the street from now Pear, back in the day, there was a Korean brother. I call him boyfriend, because that's all I knew him as boyfriend. And me and my sister both lived in an apartment building, and he was so nice to us. And he called me girlfriend because he didn't know our name, boyfriend. And we come in, and if we didn't have all of our money, he would let us get things at that time, until we got our next paycheck. And I really appreciate those times. So when I moved back to Portland and I saw the change, it just really did a lot to me. And I wanted to figure out with, these new relationships, how can I be a part of the movement forward, which was going to the Old Town, Chinatown, neighborhood association meeting. If any of y'all know me on this call, you've seen me in different spaces, and that's how I met Laura. And I'm happy to be here and be a part of like now something that I have that's going to be for our community. And one last thing before I go, I would share that during that time, we called that Old Town Fresh, because the concern for me during COVID was that we needed to wash our hands, right, for 20 seconds. We needed to wear a mask, and we needed to keep a 6-foot distance. Our houseless people did not have those resources to do that. The houseless people that were on the streets before COVID are a lot of the houseless people, along with the new people that are on the streets today. And those people, our people, my neighbors, my brothers and my sisters, went through such a traumatic time to not know what was going to happen, if anybody was going to rescue them. And it just took me, all of me with an autoimmune disease, to go out and do what I can by setting up that shop, calling Commissioner Sharon Myers, because she's over our community or part of that. She came down. She actually invited Senator Ron Wyden. He came down. I mean, I was doing work, y'all, triage work around the clock as one person with very few people. Everybody abandoned their posts. Kaya and I did not abandon our posts, which was our people, which is our heartbeat, which is our community. And so as we move forward, we can't forget about the people who are continuing to sleep on the streets. And housing is not for everyone. We have to find other solutions and alternatives. So with the tiny home communities and other alternatives that are coming about, because you mentioned about where hotels were before, people could afford to stay on their Social Security. That's half of the problem. People can't even afford to pay for a security deposit. So a lot to say, but again, like reimagining where we're going. And there's a lot of new people in Old Town that think they know Old Town, but we're gonna show them how to respect our Old Town, because it's not Old Town, it's Old Town. It has history, it's our new town, and it's where we wanna go. And it's just not Old Town, it's the Pearl District, it's Naval Hill, Slab Town. All of that was industrial, right? So I'll give it to the next speaker, because you guys got me hyped. Thank you so much.
Laquita, we are in need of another conversation, I would say, because we're just really scratching the surface of what we need to talk about and the complexities of issues. And we're really not here to have a solution today. We're here to listen and hold up the stories and the history. And Jane Gordon from the University of Oregon, your institution has invested itself in the White Stag building in Old Town. And what has it meant for you as a part of the University of Oregon to be in Old Town?
So I'm going to talk for 2 minutes because I actually feel like this group deserves like a different way of ending this than me rattling on. So I would love to be in more conversations and people, I've been in conversation with lots of people here. But I guess the one thing, you know, when you work with students, you're thinking about the future and everything that everyone else, I mean, it is rooted in the history and people, our students learn the history. And we have, for those of you who don't know, incredible faculty and students, and many of them are engaged in lots of in storytelling and in work in Old Town and around the city. One of our amazing faculty members is the one managing the video here, who's Andrew, who at the Agora Center and his group gather, and lots of very important conversations, he and Laura, and we're so grateful that they give to our students all the time. But I would just say that, and just really briefly, wanting to just highlight some of what was said earlier around what needs to happen. And I think I think the next conversation, I know a lot of this is listening, and I think some of us though want activity and action coming out of the observations of structural racism and the issues that have really impacted Old Town in particular. And I think that where some of the activism might go in listening to the comments earlier are around the activation and the incentive, you know, needing to have incentivizing the most appropriate inclusive kinds of small businesses and entrepreneurs, because Old Town, even more than downtown, isn't as closed up, right? There's more happening there with our small shops and things that are going on. And there is the potential of reclaiming Old Town for all of the histories and all of the peoples that have inhabited it in a really successful way if there was that kind of investment and support. And so I just think that, you know, again, I don't want to speak for everyone. That's, you know, it's not not my only thought about it, but we have 3 educational institutions, these cultural institutions, these great small businesses and entrepreneurs. We've lost a lot of restaurants. We need to get them back. We need to get food back into Old Town. But I always have hope for it, and we are really committed to it and engaged. But I want to cede the last few minutes to you, and you are the most amazing storyteller, the way you wove together those questionnaire answers. I just want to say that as well, but look forward to more conversations.
Thank you so much. So Jane, Laquita, and Kaya, we're going to keep working. We're going to keep envisioning, revisioning. I don't know. There always has to be a re in front of it for some reason. Reimagining. But, you know, we had this whole question and answer period, but we're not going to have time for it. So we have, Laura has been busy putting a lot of resources in the chat, and also lifting up the questionnaire that a lot of the answers came from that I read. But I want to invite Beth Burns to join us, because one of the last questions that we asked was, what does reimagining Old Town mean? And I haven't met you, Beth. Hi. But as I was reading through these answers to these many answers to quite a few questions, I was struck by the wording, and I invited Beth to share with us. And I'd like to leave this conversation today on her sharing.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for this conversation. I really enjoyed it. I envision an Old Town that is vibrant, embraces its history, is racially and culturally diverse, and is holistically healthy for everyone who lives and works here. I believe reimagining Old Town means a revitalization using innovation and diverse perspectives to create a neighborhood that improves the lives of the most vulnerable residents and cultivates meaningful change so all members can flourish. I imagine an Old Town with green space, opportunities for economic mobility, and a safe place for everyone.
So the words envision, embrace, culturally diverse, holistic, revitalization, innovation, diverse perspectives, improvement, all the words that you used are our inspiration moving forward. And I invite all of you on this call to join us for the 6th annual Vanport Mosaic Festival, held for the first time in the Northport Park blocks. It's the first time of us doing kind of a big festival. And on Saturday and Sunday, the 26th and 27th, we will be having performers, we'll be having vendors. You'll see and learn a lot from the exhibit that is up called History is Now, that has been curated by Design as Protest. And you'll get to read about the Chinatown, the Afro Village, the Japanese American Museum of Oregon, the blight, and let me get the word right, the blight exploitation, Vanport City and Racing to Change. It all happened here in Portland, Chinatown. All of these are part of an exhibit, the immigrant story, the Black athletes of Oregon, the Kalapuya land, and Japantown, and housing discrimination in Oregon. You will learn so much, and you'll realize the history that's been omitted and what you should have learned that maybe you didn't. Well, I know you didn't learn it. The history that we haven't learned that we need to know moving forward into the next generation. So bring your children, bring your young people, come and gather and celebrate community with us. We're going to have a big community procession at 5 o'clock on Sunday. Dance with us, sing with us, celebrate our return, and really uplift our humanity so that we can move forward with each other in a good way. So thank you for joining us tonight, and we'll look forward to seeing you again. Thank you, Vanport Mosaic. Thank you all who participated. I think that's a wrap.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you.